Many people are paying attention to the trial of Sam Bankman-Fried, of course, and we're in week two now and hearing from key witnesses in the case, including Gary Wang, the co-founder of FTX, and Caroline Ellison, the former CEO of Alameda Research, FTX's sister hedge fund. Since you have more than 20 years of experience with financial investigations, I'm wondering what you make of the case and all the information that's coming to the surface during the trial. What would you say are the lessons learned from the collapse of the crypto exchange SBF founded?
Got it. Yeah, so, this trial is an interesting one, and I'll say it's certainly getting more attention than most white collar cases would. But this one seems to have a bit of the makings, of almost of a Netflix series, right? We've got, tales of love, tales of drugs, allegations of corruption. And then we have some great casting with, our central figure, Sam Bankman-Fried. And, really, if you think about it, SBF kind of personifies what most Americans believe about cryptocurrency, right? It's young, it's hip, it's woke, and it seems to, live and exist outside the rules and boundaries that most of us do. But to me, this trial brings a huge opportunity, not just for the industry, but for our regulatory environment. I think it's important to remember this is not a trial against cryptocurrency, and it's really not necessarily a trial against FTX. This is a trial against, the alleged fraudulent activities of an individual, SBF. And so, I fear that this might become, or some might fear that this is a, referendum on cryptocurrency. By those who typically argue or fear that cryptocurrency is only something used or associated with illicit activity. But I think it's hopefully going to show that it's SBF, allegedly, that contributed to FTX's demise, right? It's not FTX as an entity within the cryptocurrency industry that is just the victim of a unsuitable or unsustainable business or industry. And so hopefully this trial puts some pressure, but I'm hoping to see is pressure on regulators and lawmakers to close that gap that the SBF team, it appears, is looking to use in its case. And there just continues to be a pressing need for the regulatory framework specific to cryptocurrency. And what the facts in this case are showing, and it's salacious, right? These details are eye-popping in many instances. But again, it's important to remember that the reason for these details and the importance of these details coming to light is to speak to really what the allegations are. And the allegations here against SBF are those of fraud, right? And fraud goes to the intent, to what you intended to do and whether or not you intended willfully to commit the harm. Right, so that's where the testimony of Mr. Wang and Ms. Ellison that's coming down the pipeline, I believe, as early as today, is going to be important in the prosecution building their case.
It has been 11 months since FTX filed for bankruptcy and SBF stepped down as CEO. What do you think has changed between then and now? Obviously, that failure led to an erosion of trust in the crypto industry. But do you think trust has been restored since then? What do you think it will take for people to have confidence in the industry once again?
That's right. I mean, I think, again, it's important to remember that bad behavior happens everywhere and happens in every industry. And again, this is not necessarily a trial against whether or not SBF broke the rules. It's a trial about his actions and how they caused this demise. And so at the core of FTX, and I'll be honest, I have not had enough insight into the inner workings of FTX to understand as a business platform, the substance and the viability of this business. But from what I do understand, there is a model here and there is a necessity for businesses like FTX to be able, for, crypto users to be able to both onboard to use the cryptocurrency, to get the cryptocurrency, and then to be able to offboard it. And it really comes down to individual accountability within the organizations. I'm a bit of a stickler on individual accountability. I really feel like it's important to pave your own way in many instances, right? It is hard to blame others for what you might have been able to prevent. And in this case, this is, again, really a story about an individual and not necessarily a business. With the right individual and the right motivations, and again, the right framework in which to operate, FTX could be, quite successful. Again, putting aside what I don't know about the rest of its inner workings, but, again, taking out SBF's alleged improper behavior, there's, like many companies, there's still a viable, lucrative and important business there.
So we have seen some regulatory developments of crypto here in the U.S. since the collapse of FTX. For example, in July, U.S. lawmakers advanced the Fit for the 21st Century Act to establish a crypto framework. And more recently, Senator Elizabeth Warren's crypto money laundering bill has been gaining more support on Capitol Hill. But do you think enough was accomplished since that massive failure?
No, if I'm being honest, I don't. And I really, again, going back to this hope, looking at the bright side of these situations, I hope this is an opportunity for everybody, including the regulators and the lawmakers, maybe those that have been more reticent to engage in this discussion, see the opportunity here and understand and underscore the importance of needing, those guardrails. And I think what this needs, or what the U.S. needs, is smart regulation, right? Not just regulation, but smart regulation. And what I mean by that is we could close out 2023 with, let's say, enough judgments or a decision that arms, and I'm just going to use the SEC as an example, that arms the SEC with what it needs, to enforce, and that is its definition of a security. And, with that will bring regulation. There are existing regulations that come with that definition of a security, what that would then apply to exchanges like FTX. But that might not necessarily be smart. And what I mean by that is that if you look at how other jurisdictions are approaching cryptocurrency regulation. So the EU, for example, is taking a very consultative approach, which I think is important here, but it's also acknowledging that there are fundamental inherent differences with crypto assets than our traditional assets. And so it looks to regulate the activity in the industry rather than the asset itself, right? So if you think about, cryptocurrency and blockchain, oftentimes you're dealing with assets that are formed by a decentralized body. There's really no individual or group of individuals you can point to, or it's incredibly automated. And so because of that, the EU, again, to use them as an example, is saying, well, let's put the responsibility then on those providers to say, you're the responsible for determining what the rules are for being listed, right? In the US, we regulate an exchange like an FTX, for example, based off the asset it lists. It is dependent on if it's listing assets that are considered securities, well, now it's going to be regulated as an exchange. And the EU is taking the different approach and saying, we're going to regulate your activity. It's up to you as to what you're going to list. If you think you set the requirements, you set the guidelines, but then it's up to you to monitor, to regulate, to make sure that that's happening, right? And that is a much different perspective in placing the risks which exist in the cryptocurrency industry, shifting the risk to the exchange to account for the fact that there's really nobody to hold, in many cases, nobody to hold accountable on the other side. And I think it would be great if the U.S. could take a similar approach. I believe the CFTC recently, one of the commissioners proposed a sandbox-like pilot program, which I think would be incredibly effective in this case and would move us toward effective regulation.
So what would you say is the main thing preventing mass adoption of crypto? Many industry insiders I spoke with point to the lack of regulatory clarity. Do you agree?
I do to some extent. I do because of the lack of regulatory clarity, you end up with more exceptions, more quote unquote illegal activities because it appears like it's outside of our norms, right? And that's what gets headlines and that's what gets news. And rightfully so, it creates a buyer beware mentality with people, which I think is important. I mean, I don't I don't want to give the impression that I'm saying it's safe and, as long as you've got the right people at the helm, this is, feel free to invest. That's not what I'm saying at all. And it is the regulations, I think, to some extent that create that barrier for people. And it's because, so again, going back to my opinions on individual accountability, I'm often the one that says when somebody, has experienced a bad investment or made a decision that they then regret, personally, my thoughts are, well, maybe you could do more research to vet that decision before you make it. But in this case, I'm sensitive to the fact that doesn't exist because of well, for a few reasons, but including because of a lack of regulations. So with the crypto industry, in order for an investor or a customer to get comfortable, right, they'll have to do their due diligence. But you've got, let's say, 3 primary factors that would prevent currently investors from doing that. One, and this is a bit inherent, you've got a complicated technology and a lot, again, of these assets, and the industry is decentralized and automated through smart contracts. And so if you take, for example, the Alameda alleged favorable liquidity provision in the code, again, it's code. Not a lot of people know how to read code. So even, when that becomes open source, you've got a disconnect between the knowledge base of the people who are trying to review that and understand what it means, and the reality of what the code is showing. So that's one problem. 2 is because of the lack of regulations, there's virtually a vacuum where no information exists. These companies are not required to issue financial statements. There are no disclosures, which are incredibly important when it comes to kind of the investing environment. And so with some baseline regulations, you start to require these companies to put out the disclosures and to create more transparency than they're accustomed to. And we've done that, and we've built that into our existing regulations because we have found that transparency and disclosures are of the utmost importance for informing and educating investors to be able to make smart decisions. And then finally, even when that information exists, the threat actors in this space have become so sophisticated that even investors have a hard time understanding or believing what they're seeing, right? You can easily create websites that look legitimate. You can create documents that look legitimate, pictures of people, C-suite photos, et cetera. But the investing public has a hard time understanding whether or not that's real. And so again, bringing that level of reporting requirements and documentation is going to enable people to better do their due diligence and hopefully become more comfortable.